Hi everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Damn Canada with me, Dee Dee. If you are new here, hi, hello, and welcome. It is great to have you. Here on Damn Canada, I like to cover all the lesser known murder, mystery, and mayhem cases that go on here in Canada and Canada only. And occasionally I throw in the more known cases. If you have noticed, yes, I am filming in a different spot again. The only reason I am switching it up right now is because I did get this new microphone and I wanted to film this video with it. But then when I went to start going to use it, I realized I probably should learn how before putting out a video right after opening it. So this audio is not recorded with this microphone, but hopefully my next one will be. And I also want to know which place you guys like my recordings. Do you like it in my corner area? Do you like it when you see the outside and the windows? Or do you like my my nerd setup of all my things that I love in my background? So let me know what you guys think. I would love to hear it. With that being said, we're gonna get right into the video. There are a lot of aspects to this case, and so I have decided to do the timeline route. And so I will be going over a lot of dates in the timeline order of everything that goes on, but I won't be using specific names that much just because there are so many names involved with the FLQ. I just don't want it to get too complicated with just everything, because this is a very complicated topic. And with also that being said, because it is a complicated topic, I may get something wrong. I have done my best to try and make sure everything was in a proper timeline and I didn't get anything wrong. But of course, I can only do as best as I can, and I may have made a mistake. But if you do know that I have made a mistake, please correct me down in the comments down below, because that's the only way I will know that I did make that mistake, and that's the only way I will learn. So I do appreciate that as well. So without further ado, we will get into today's story. Also, all my notes are under the screen, just because I am very bad at remembering things. Our story today takes place in the province of Quebec between approximately 1960 to 1970. If you are not aware, Quebec is a province where the majority of the population is French speaking and still is French speaking to this day. Prior to the 1960s election, Quebec was mostly ran by the Roman Catholic Church. Now, I'm not going to deep dive too much into that, but basically in 1960, there was a provincial election that seen the Liberals win, and with Jean Lesage as the leader. This in turn basically started what is now known as the Quiet Revolution. Now, with the Liberal government in power, their main goal was to basically separate healthcare and the education system from the Roman Catholic Church, who had been in control up until that time. The Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Education was created, along with massive investments to the public education system and provincial infrastructure. And along with that, they also allowed for the civil service to unionize. Now, these were pretty intense social, political, and cultural changes. And although these changes would have an overall good impact on Quebec, with things like literacy rates increasing and just among a lot of other things, there were still people feeling extremely threatened by all of these changes coming so rapidly. From these changes, the economy was largely controlled by the English-speaking interests, and the French Quebecers were not happy about this. Separatists, which are people who are in favor of Quebec separating from Canada, felt as though these changes were taking the French out of Quebec. There were strong feelings that English investors and such were gaining / had too much economic power in Quebec, and that was very threatening to the people who were very connected to the French language. Now, I won't get too into the separatism stuff, but it does go very far back. It is not just a bunch of people thinking some crazy thoughts and having some outrageous views. It can be traced back to when what's now known as Quebec area was colonized by Britain in the 1763, which was originally a French colony before they took it from the indigenous people, but that's another video. And so when all these changes were coming in and the separatists were feeling threatened, Some of them felt a little more strongly than others, to put it lightly. In 1962, 3 separatists named Raymond Villeneuve, Gabriel Hudson, and Georges Skodas got together and formed the now infamous group, the FLQ, the Front de Libération de Quebec. The goal of this group was to establish an independent and socialist Quebec through violent measures because they didn't believe that it could be achieved through the political process. The FLQ began to grow and it operated as what is known as a clandestine cell system. And so to give a super basic explanation, it's a bunch of smaller groups of people which are called cells, which make up the whole of the FLQ. Each cell has their own names and even views and such. And as a little side note to keep in mind, the events that take place are done by various cells of the FLQ, but I won't be using the different cell names just because I feel like it will get too complicated and a little bit confusing, and so I'm just trying to avoid that, but I will be using the most known ones at the end of the video. And even though they were all part of the FLQ, not all agreed with each other's actions, with groups denouncing each other throughout the whole time period. The FLQ knew that the newspapers were not going to speak about independence, but they did know they would speak about bombs. And so on February 23rd, 1963, a Molotov cocktail was thrown through the window of an English language radio station called CKGM in Montreal. And from there, the bombings continued to escalate. On March 8th, 3 military barracks in Montreal and Westmount were attacked during the night with incendiary bombs. And on April 1st, 3 bombs were set to explode. One was set at a federal tax building, another set at a central station located in Montreal, and one on a CN railway. And it actually just so happened that a train that was transporting Prime Minister John Diefenbaker was set to pass over the bomb, but luckily it was discovered before that could happen. When Prime Minister John Diefenbaker heard about the bomb attempt, he famously replied back with, "Is this Ireland, sir?" Then on April 16th, the FLQ would publish what would be their first manifesto, titled Message de FLQ à la Nation. And in this manifesto, they declared a revolution. They targeted the English community, the federal government, and the business community in hopes that these attacks would spark a violent revolution. On April 20th, another bomb went off, and this time against an RCMP headquarters in Westmount. Then the next day, on April 21st, the bombings would claim their first victim. Wilfred O'Neill, who was a 65-year-old war veteran working as a night guard at the Canadian Forces Recruiting Center in Montreal, he was doing a shift when he walked to the rear of the building and walked over to the garbage cans. He noticed that a package was lodged in between 2 of the garbage cans, and when he went to go remove the package, it exploded in his hands. He was 1 month away from receiving his pension. Even though his death was shocking to the community, Quebec's Premier, Jean Lesage, dismissed the incident as a matter of little importance and also dismissed the FLQ. And at the beginning of May, the bombings increased. Maybe the FLQ didn't like how they were being dismissed. On May 3rd, 1 bomb exploded at the building of Royal Canadian Legion veterans, and 2 other bombs are found, but they were dismantled. And then 4 days later, on May 7th, the city of Montreal made an announcement offering $10,000 reward to whoever can provide information leading to the capture of FLQ members. Now, on the night of May 10th, a dynamite charge exploded against the wall of a Black Watch regiment in Montreal. On May 13th, a bomb exploded at a technical service unit at the Canadian Air Force in Montreal. And then on May 16th, an explosive goes off near the reservoir of the Golden Eagle refinery. Of course, with all these bombings going off all over Quebec, it made headlines. And those headlines caught the attention of a young police officer named Robert Cote. Upon seeing all these headlines, he decided that he would volunteer for the Montreal Bomb Squad unit. On May 17th of 1963, he got his first assignment. This day is now known as Black Friday in Westmount. On Friday, May 17th of 1963, 10 bombs, each made with 4 sticks of dynamite, were distributed into residential mailboxes across the town of Westmount. 5 of these bombs exploded around 3 a.m. Robert Cote was one of the officers called on to take part of the defusing of the rest of the bombs, and along with him was Canadian Army Sergeant Major Walter Legard. Major Legard was able to successfully dismantle 2 of the bombs that had been placed, with his bare hands no less, and apparently this was quite a sight to see. He moved on to the next bomb, which was found at the corner of Lansdowne Avenue and Westmount Avenue. This photo was taken while Walter was working on dismantling this 3rd bomb, and a few seconds after this photo was taken, the bomb exploded. And here is the photo taken a few seconds after the bomb. Everyone thought he was dead. His injuries were catastrophic, if you could imagine. The bomb blew most of his left arm off and crushed his face and chest. However, he amazingly survived. Although he did sustain brain damage, was paralyzed on his right side, and lost the ability to speak. He was awarded the George Medal in January of 1964 for conspicuous courage and outstanding devotion to duty. And from then on, more FLQ cells were being formed and bombs were continuously going off. Unfortunately, I cannot tell you about every single bombing incident because there was actually more than 200 bombs put out between 1963 and 1970. Not all of them did detonate. A lot of them were dismantled, but a good majority, I believe over 150 of them, did explode. And so with that number being so high, I will only be covering the major significant ones. On August 22nd of 1963, 700 dynamite sticks were stolen from a construction site by the FLQ. On January 30th of 1964, one of the FLQ cells stole $20,000 worth of weapons from the barracks of the Fusiliers Montreal Regiment. I might have said that wrong. They got away with 59 semi-automatic rifles, 4 Bren rifles, 34 submachine guns, 4 60mm mortars, 3 bazooka rocket launchers, a handful of grenades, 5 automatic revolvers, 13,022 caliber bullets, 2,762 caliber bullets, and 2,300 .303 caliber bullets. And they also stole 15 radio transceivers, 2 portable phones, headlamps, electrical wire, and a bunch of other random things. They got away with a lot of shit. But apparently it wasn't enough because on February 20th, they robbed the barrack of the 62nd Regiment of Campaign Artillery in Shawinigan. This time, the robbery was an estimated $25,000. They got 33 semi-automatic rifles, pistols, a good quantity of bullets, and 12 transceivers, combat uniforms, and helmets, and 1 stencil duplicator. Then on August 29th, the FLQ robbed the International Firearms Gun Store in Montreal, stealing several cases of guns. And during this robbery, an employee named Leslie McWilliams was killed. And unfortunately, another employee named Alfred Pinish was mistaken as one of the robbers, and he was actually killed by the police. And in 1965, more bombs had gone off throughout the year and others were found and dismantled, but thankfully there was no casualties. Then in 1966, on May 5th, a letter bomb went off at the Le Grandier shoe factory in Montreal. Therese Morin was a 65-year-old secretary there, and she had sustained extensive injuries from the bomb exploding, and she ended up passing away en route to the hospital. Then on July 14th, 16-year-old Jean Corbeau, who was an FLQ member, was planting a bomb at a Dominion textile factory located in the St. Henry neighborhood in Montreal when it exploded and killed him. And I do believe he was the first and only FLQ member to be killed by one of their own bombs. In November of 1967, the FLQ published their first issue of their new journal called La Victoire, which contained detailed drawings of how to build a bomb. This was just one of many FLQ journals that were published throughout their time. I just didn't feel like it was that necessary to list all of them. But yeah, if you do want to go read them, they are all listed online. And you can even find translated versions as well. And also in the year of 1967, there was more bombs to go off, but there were no injuries or casualties from those, thankfully. And then in 1968, another major bombing took place. 2 bombs had been placed at the Eaton store of downtown Montreal, and one had exploded, and the second was removed and dismantled. And this took place on November 22nd. This year also marked the year that Pierre Trudeau would win the federal election and start his first of 2 terms as the Prime Minister of Canada. Along with that political change, a new democratic path to separatism was presented to the separatists. The Separatist Party Québécois, also known as Parti Québécois, was formed and led by René Lévesque. Now, January of 1969 seen a few bombings, but it was February 13th bombing of the Montreal Stock Exchange that would be one of the most significant bombings of the FLQ. The bomb went off about 40 minutes before the end of trading, and the bomb demolished a good amount of the trading floor, the visitor gallery, and the building's northeast wall. And it also left 27 people hospitalized, and with many more being treated with injuries on location. The estimated damages for this was over $1 million. Now, throughout the course of all of the bombings and everything, the police were making tons of arrests, and there was tons of FLQ cells being dismantled and the new ones would pop up. But the most significant arrest was the arrest of Pierre-Paul Geoffrey. He pled guilty to 31 of the FLQ bombings between May of 1968 and March of 1969, including the Montreal Stock Exchange explosion. He was faced with 129 charges and ended up receiving 124 life sentences plus 25 years. This sentence was the longest prison sentence at the time levied in not just Canada, but all of the British Commonwealth. On May 5th, 2 FLQ members who had fled to the United States hijacked a National Airlines Boeing 727 out of New York City and ordered it to fly them to Cuba, which is a pretty significant move on their part. Then on September 29th, the mayor of Montreal, Jean Drapeau's home was bombed around 5 a.m. The mayor wasn't home, but his wife and son were. But luckily, they were able to escape without being harmed. On November 20th, a little after 9 p.m., a bomb exploded on the ground floor stairwell of the Communication Arts building at Loyola College. Damage to the building was estimated at $150,000. There was hundreds of evening students in the classes on the upper floors, but fortunately, none of them were harmed from the explosion. In the spring of 1970, there was a provincial election where the Parti Québécois went up against the Liberals and the Union Nationale. They gained 23% of the vote, but only 7 seats, and losing to the Liberals. And this loss was pretty significant because it solidified the FLQ's views that violence was the only way to achieve Quebec's independence, and that the Parti Québécois would never succeed in their ways. And that's when the violence escalated. After that election loss, the FLQ launched a wave of bombs, with 28 bombs being placed and 19 of them exploding. 5 people were hospitalized and 1 person was killed. Now, even though all of these attacks had been taking place throughout the years, with many, many more that I have not mentioned, the police and government still had very little information on the FLQ. And this was due in part to the lack of police efforts in infiltrating and finding out more information on the FLQ. But even the police at the time admitted later on that they really didn't know what they were doing, since they had never dealt with this type of situation before. and let alone all of Canada. On June 24th of 1970, the FLQ's bombs traveled outside of Quebec. The National Defense Headquarters building in Ottawa, Ontario, was bombed, which ended up killing communications supervisor Jean d'Arc Saint-Germain. Now, the largest bomb that was found was dismantled before it could go off in July of 1970. Behind the Bank of Montreal building in the financial district, in the early hours of July 12th, a Volkswagen Beetle was found parked and full of explosives. Robert Cote arrived to dismantle the bomb, and he actually thought that he was just dismantling a 10-pound bomb that was found under the passenger seat. But once he had dismantled that bomb and the team had thought that they were pretty much done for the night, they noticed something behind the driver's seat, and it was a case that had 50 pounds worth of dynamite inside. They searched the rest of the car and found that another case of dynamite was shoved under the engine hood of the car, and then there was also loose sticks scattered throughout. In total, there was around 150 pounds of dynamite rigged to explode in that Volkswagen. That amount of dynamite could have leveled the entire city block. And then in 1970, October came, along with unimaginable events that would go down in history that is now known as the October Crisis, and which is the most likely reason you clicked on this video. On October 5th of 1970 at 8:15 a.m., the October Crisis began. 3 FLQ members from the Liberation Cell, one of 2 cells remaining of the FLQ, entered into the home of James Cross and kidnapped him at gunpoint. James Cross was a British diplomat, and the FLQ felt that James represented everything that they hated that was going on in Quebec. While at gunpoint, James Cross was forced to walk out of his home and into a taxi that was waiting for him outside. After James Cross and the members were in the vehicle, it sped away from the home. And with this kidnapping, it became the first ever political kidnapping in all of Canada and North America. There was no indication that something like this was going to take place, nor were the police and government even expecting it. Hours after the kidnapping, the FLQ set out a list of demands, which included the release of 23 prisoned members of the FLQ, which they called political prisoners, $5,000, a television broadcast of the FLQ manifesto, and safe passage to Cuba or Algeria. They threatened to kill James Cross if their demands were not met, and they also gave the government 24 hours to comply. Now, of course, the Trudeau government did not want to agree to anything at all, not wanting to open the door for more demands. But in the end, they did agree to one of the demands, and that was to televise the FLQ manifesto. The days following, the French newspaper published the FLQ manifesto, and it was also read on Radio Canada. And with this manifesto being released, a lot of people actually seemed to agree with it, because apparently it was very well written, and it had some pretty good points, which a lot of Quebecers said. René Lévesque had also published a newspaper article imploring the FLQ to not inflict violence on James Cross or anyone else. The Liberation Cell provided proof that James Cross was still alive by photo and also extended the deadline for demands to be met on October 10th at 6 p.m. On October 10th, René Lévesque of the Parti Québécois called on the Quebec government to save the hostages by meeting the demands. And then shortly before the 6 p.m. deadline at 5:40 p.m., the Quebec Justice Minister, Jérôme Choquette, announced that if James Cross was released, the Liberation Cell would be granted safe passage out of Canada, but no other demands would be met. Then a little while after that announcement was made and the 6 p.m. deadline had passed, 2 masked members of the Chenier Cell, armed with machine guns, kidnapped Quebec Cabinet Minister Pierre Laporte while he was playing football with his nephew on his front lawn in St. Lambert. They had found his address through the phone book. After it was made public that Pierre Laporte had been kidnapped, elected officials started blowing up the phones with requests of police protection. The next day, the Chenier cell issued a communique. They threatened to kill Pierre Laporte unless all 7 FLQ demands were met by 10 p.m. Along with this demand, they also released 2 letters that Pierre Laporte had written. One was to his wife, and the other was to Premier Robert Bourassa. And shortly before that 10 p.m. deadline, Premier Robert Bourassa announced on the radio that he would not meet the FLQ's demands, but that he was open to further negotiation. The Chenier cell responded by postponing Pierre Laporte's execution. The following day, on October 12th, Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau asked the Canadian Armed Forces to deploy soldiers in Ottawa to protect high-profile officials. Also on this day, the Liberation Cell issued a communique saying that James Cross and Pierre Laporte will be released if the 23 FLQ prisoners are set free and all police actions against the FLQ are ended. This communique contradicted what the Chenier cell had said just the day prior, which showed the authorities that the cells seemed to not be on the same page. Soldiers were deployed on the streets of Ottawa right away, and it really concerned the community to see such a military presence in their own neighborhoods where they had not seen any attacks. A reporter for CBC News named Tim Ralph decided to do what any good reporter would do, and he confronted Pierre Trudeau as he was walking into the front entrance of the Parliament building. Tim Ralph expressed his concern of the military presence, and Pierre Trudeau replied back with what all of Canada would never forget.
In the kind of society that you live in.
There's a lot of bleeding hearts around who just don't like to see people with helmets and guns. All I can say is go on and bleed, but it's more important to keep law and order in this society than to be worried about weak-kneed people who don't like the looks of a soldier.
At any cost? At any cost? How far would you go with that? How far would you extend that?
Well, just watch me.
On October 15th, the Quebec government formally requested assistance from the armed forces to help local police. Within an hour of the request, 1,000 soldiers were deployed at key locations in Montreal, and the Quebec government, along with Montreal's mayor, requested further federal assistance. This same day in the afternoon, around 3,000 students had rallied in support of the FLQ and called on to the government to meet their demands. And then later that evening, the Quebec government made an announcement that it would meet the demand for safe passage out of Canada to Cuba for both remaining cell members. And along with that, they also announced that they would release 5 FLQ members from prison, but on parole, in return for the safe return of James Cross and Pierre Laporte. And the next day, of course, was October 16th. And this is the day that would spark extreme controversy across Canada and would forever be burned in Canadian history. On this day, October 16th of 1970, Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau invoked the War Measures Act. This was the first time ever the act had been invoked during peaceful times. The other times were during World War I and World War II. The War Measures Act was invoked after the Premier of Quebec, the municipal government, and the Montreal police made the request. This act is the strongest card that the government could have played. And in easiest terms to understand, it's martial law. Under the act, the government had extreme power. The FLQ was outlawed and membership became a criminal act. And normal rights were suspended while the act was in place so that authorities could arrest and hold people without charge. Now, this was an extremely controversial move, like I said, by the government, if you could have guessed. Former Prime Minister John Diefenbaker expressed his disagreement with this move in the House of Commons, along with the Progressive Conservative leader, Robert Stanfield. And NDP leader Thomas Douglas compared it to using a sledgehammer to crack open a peanut. But a public opinion poll indicated that the majority supported invoking the act, although I am not sure if this poll was just for the Quebec province or all of Canada. The very next day after the War Measures Act was invoked, a very sad and shocking discovery was made. Near St. Hubert Airport, police came upon a suspicious car, which they had found after receiving an anonymous tip. And upon further investigation of the vehicle, Pierre Laporte's lifeless, bloodied body was found in the trunk. An autopsy would later reveal that his cause of death was strangulation. The FLQ members of the Chenier cell would later claim that things got out of hand after Pierre Laporte had tried to break a window and escape through it, which in turn led to him bleeding and cutting himself, and a fight broke out, and amongst them all fighting, it would ultimately lead to his horrific death. Warrants were issued for the arrest of Paul Rose, who the car belonged to, and Marc Carbonneau, who was connected to the kidnapping and murder of Pierre Laporte. About a week later, warrants for Jacques Rose, Bernard Lordy, and Francis Simard were also issued. This death was a huge shock to everyone. The FLQ lost what little support they had left from the public, and the War Measures Act basically immediately failed by having a hostage murdered. And it was a line that no one thought they would ever cross. Not even the Liberation Cell, who had actually released a communique on how they were not going to execute Cross in an attempt to encourage the Chenier Cell to do the same. But this communique wasn't actually made public until December, which of course was just far too late. The kidnappers, now turned murder suspects, were now in hiding, and the efforts to find James Cross intensified. By October 20th, there had been over 1,628 raids conducted under the War Measures Act. On October 26th, Barbara Cross, James Cross's wife, made an appeal on the radio station CKLM. She said, "To those who hold my husband, I wish to express my confidence that as he is a victim of circumstances, he will be well treated. I entreat them to free him without further delay." On November 2nd, the federal government and the Quebec government jointly offered $150,000 as a reward for information leading to the arrest of the kidnappers/murderers. Then on November 6th, Bernard Lordy was arrested after the police had raided an apartment, but the other cell members had actually managed to escape. On November 21st, the police received a letter written by Cross indicating that he was still alive. And then on December 1st, the House of Commons passed an act called the Public Order Temporary Measures Act. This act was stated to provide temporary emergency powers for the preservation of public order in Canada. This act replaced the War Measures Act that was in effect. Then the next night, on December 2nd, the police used buses and soldiers to surround a duplex apartment after they had received a tip that said that that's where James Cross was being kept. But this tip also included that the house was full of dynamite. The community all gathered onto the streets to watch the events unfold. It was a madhouse with soldiers and police and reporters and just civilians all over the place waiting to see what would happen. Then, hours after intense negotiations between the police and the kidnappers, a deal was struck in the early hours of December 3rd. The deal was that the kidnappers would be flown to Cuba in exchange for James Cross. The kidnappers got James Cross into a vehicle and had him sit in the middle seat in the back. On either side of him, a member of the Chenier cell was sitting there, and each of them were holding a 10-pound bomb. This was to ensure that the police wouldn't shoot at them, because if they did, they would all die. Helicopters with reporters and cameras followed the convoy all the way to the site of Expo 67. And just for a side note, I don't think I mentioned this. The reason that Cuba was being requested is because Cuba had openly supported the FLQ's efforts and everything. And then with his kidnappers on a flight to Cuba, after 59 days of being held hostage in an apartment and losing 22 pounds, James Cross was now a free man once again. He would later say that his captors were courteous to him and he was never harmed. Then on December 23rd, Pierre Trudeau announced that the armed forces would be withdrawn from Quebec by January 4th. The rest of the Chenier cell members would eventually be found and forced to surrender on December 28th. And the next year, in 1971, on February 3rd, a report presented to the House of Commons revealed that 497 people were arrested under the War Measures Act and the Public Order Act. And out of that 497 people that were arrested, only 62 were charged, which has always been highlighted when talking about the War Measures Act being used. On March 12th, it was announced that the Quebec government would pay up to $30,000 in compensation to the people who were unjustly detained under the War Measures Act, and that is approximately $200,000 in today's money. And then finally, on April 30th of 1971, the Public Order Act, which had replaced the War Measures Act, officially ended. Now, over the next 10 years, all of the FLQ members who had fled to Cuba would eventually return to Canada, and they were all tried, with the last one being on May 27th of 1983. And I'm pretty sure none of them ever served more than a year or two in jail, but I'm not positive on that one. Now, with the fall of the FLQ, the separatists in Quebec only had one more option to turn to for help with the Quebec independence, and that was the Parti Québécois. And because of this, they ended up getting quite a following. And in 1976, René Lévesque, leading the Parti Québécois, they won the general election, which started Quebec's path to a referendum on separation. In 1980, they had a vote to separate, but the people decided to stay in Canada. Then again, in 1995, a second referendum was put forward, and the Quebec people voted 50.5 for no and 49.5 for yes. It was an extremely close call that is still brought up to this day. And since then, there has not been another referendum. There are still people who do feel strongly on Quebec separation, but it's not as many as it used to be. And as the younger generation gets older, it seems that the support on Quebec separation is on a regular decline. A report that was issued in 1981 by the Federal MacDonald Commission and the Keeble Inquiry showed that after the October crisis was over, the federal government had given unclear instructions to the RCMP security service to take part in break-ins, thefts, and electronic surveillance, all without warrants. And this was all condemned as illegal. The MacDonald Commission also called on the creation of a new civilian security agency separate from the RCMP, and this led to the creation of CSIS, which stands for the Canadian Security and Intelligence Services, which was created in 1984. And then later in 1988, the War Measures Act was repealed and replaced with the Emergencies Act. This new act created limited and specific powers for the government to deal with security emergencies. Under the Emergencies Act, the cabinet orders and regulations must be reviewed by Parliament and are subject to the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms and the Canadian Bill of Rights. And then on February 14th, 2022, just a few days ago of me recording this video, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, Pierre Trudeau's son, declared a public order emergency through the Emergencies Act in order to deal with protesters across Canada who are protesting what seems to be a never-ending list of mandates being put forward on the Canadian people by the Canadian government. And just like his father, Justin Trudeau invoking this act is once again highly controversial. This gives federal authorities to impose fines and freeze the funding for protests and blockades, among other things. Once the public order emergency is declared, it is considered in effect immediately and will expire in 30 days unless the declaration is revoked or extended. One of the requirements for the government to invoke this level of power, though, is that they must table a motion in both the House and the Senate within 7 sitting days, outlining why federal officials feel the powers are required and detailing what specific measures will be taken. Once the motion is tabled, debate has to begin the next sitting day, and according to the Act, must continue without interruption until the vote is called. Now, I am not going to touch on this situation anymore because it is an ongoing situation, and because I know that people have very strong opinions for either side, no matter where you sit or where your thoughts are on all of this. And with that being said, I do want to make it clear that I really hope that you guys keep the conversation in the comments civil, and please be as respectful as possible to the others that you're speaking with. And for anyone out of the loop on what exactly is going on with the whole Emergencies Act and the protests going on in Canada, I would just recommend that you Google Freedom Convoy Canada, and you can read everyone's perception and opinions on the topic. And so now I do want to hear what you guys think. Do you think it was necessary for Pierre Trudeau to invoke the War Measures Act? And do you have any thoughts or opinions on everything? I don't even mind if you do comment about the stuff going on right now. But once again, please just try to keep it civil. And if you're from the future watching this video, how does everything turn out? I'm very curious, and I want to wait. Anyways, that's all I've got for today, and I wish you all the best. Stay safe out there, guys. Bye.